Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Stacy, I'm going to ask you just to verify that my presentation's coming through and my audio's coming through.
You sound clear, and the screen is full screen with your presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stacy. So welcome, everyone, to today's presentation. My name is John, and I'm the archivist at the Chester County Archives. And on behalf of everyone within our department, on behalf of the Chester County History Center, first of all, I just want to thank you for showing interest and being present today. This is one of another program we've offered in the last maybe 6 months that we've gotten a really positive, almost overwhelming response. The numbers that people registered is really amazing and cool to see. So literally on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank you for supporting us, supporting our mission, supporting local history. It's funny, as I was coming up here, I was talking to the receptionists and the secretaries and telling them we have a presentation, and they were just like blown away that people were interested to learn about what we do here. So again, I'm kind of the public facing guy, but there's a whole department that's really appreciative of what you all showing interest in what we do. So thank you so much. If you're interested in more programs that we have to offer, I would recommend following us on Facebook. Maybe Stacy, if you don't mind dropping a link to our Facebook page in the description. That's where we post, upcoming events, information, local history posts. So follow us on Facebook. But today's presentation is a little bit different because we will be sharing a new video that we've created at the end of this. So I figured I will jump on here, maybe talk for about 30 minutes or so, just give me some added historical context about this oldest record at the Chester County Archives. And then about 30 minutes or so, I will play a video. And then after the video, I'll come back on, have some concluding remarks, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions. So just bear with us a little bit. I don't have access to the chat box, so if anyone who's tuning in has any questions, you can put them in the chat box and Stacy will be monitoring that. If there's any questions that Stacy can't answer along the way, we'll save them till the end and I'll address them then. So without further ado, if you've heard this before, if you've attended one of our presentations, I probably explained this, so I hope you don't mind me explaining a little bit about our department before we jump into things, because all of you probably registered for this event through the Chester County History Center's Eventbrite page, yet here we are in a county government building. So let me tell you a little bit about the Chester County Archives and Records Services. We were created in 1982. About the early 1980s, the Chester County government, they recognized they have a whole bunch of historic records that they really didn't know how to take care of. You can imagine a clerk in the Register of Wills office, what she was thinking when a historian came to her saying, I want to take a look at a will from 1720, or someone in the Recorder of Deeds office having to help someone do historic property research. So about the 1980s, the Chester County government recognized they needed to do something to better make these historic records more accessible and preserve them a little bit better. So they partnered with the Chester County History Center, formerly known as the Historical Society. So in 1982, this unique partnership was created. Again, we are a public county department under the operation of the Chester County Commissioners, yet we are administered by History Center employees. So myself, Stacy, director, all the archivists in our department, we are employed by the Chester County History Center, but the county government, they supply, the physical space, the resources, and the equipment to take care of these records. And the mission of the Chester County Archives, our mission is to preserve and make accessible the historic records of the Chester County government. And that's a really important phrase because think of what the Chester County government does. They don't handle school records, they don't handle church records or cemetery records or photographs, really. None of those records are in the Chester County Archives because they're not government records. Government records are things like tax records and court cases and deeds and estate files and things like that. Chester County as a government administration was created by William Penn in November 1682, about 341 years ago now. And for 341 years, the Chester County government has been generating that paper trail of taxes and deeds and court cases and things like that. And those records, that's what we keep at the Chester County Archives. So again, we create or preserve these historic records. Our most recent record, people ask us, when's our end date? Well, depending on what the departments give us. So for example, the Planning Commission, they just gave us some of their meeting minutes from a meeting in February 2023. So we have some pretty recent records, but we also have some pretty old historic ones. And obviously the oldest one that you all are here to learn more about today is this court docket from 1681 to 1697. And if you're scratching your head about that date, 1681, that's a good thing, because I just told you William Penn created this government in November 1682. So you should be paying attention to that start date right there. But here's what it looks like. You notice today it has this nice exterior shell, this brown bound leather casing. It didn't always look like that, right? In the 1680s, it didn't look like this. There was preservation work done in the 1970s. So we got that nice outer shell. If you notice in the left-hand corner, you see each page is encapsulated in this white material that's known as cellulose acetate. Nowadays, we've recognized that's probably not the best preservation method. There is some plastic material that we don't really want touching the historic record. Good news is that's not going to be an issue, assuming we keep that record at a stable, consistent environment. So if you go into the stacks of the Chester County Archives today, you'll notice it's going to be kept between about 60 to 65 degrees, about 40 to 45% relative humidity. It's going to be like that today, tomorrow, in a heat wave during the middle of summer. It's going to be like that throughout the year. And that means there's not going to be any extracting or contracting of the record, which means that there shouldn't be any stimulation for that acid to do any damage to it. But yeah, so it looks a little differently today than it did in the 1680s. But here it is. And again, if you're wondering about that term or that year 1681, I'll get to that in a minute. But I do just want to kind of explain, I'm using that word court docket, but it did much more than that. Of course, you had civil cases being represented in here, criminal civil cases, but it was basically like a minute book of the Chester County government, because until about the early 1700s, there weren't these specialized county departments. So it basically just reflected all the functions of the Chester County government. Court cases, estate files, laying out roads, erecting bridges, having people administer an estate, things like that. So it has a really sweeping representation of what the county government was doing in the 1680s. And just for some added context, I think this is really cool. 1681, again, it's 341 years ago. That's about 106 years older than the United States Constitution, 95 years older than the Declaration of Independence. If you remember the Salem witch trials, that was happening about the 1690s. So this is 10 years older than the Salem witch trials. What's most interesting, though, is this record is older than the Chester County government. Because again, William Penn forms the Chester County government in November 1682. This record begins in 1681. And if we open up to the very first page, the folks who are joining us in the room, that's the page I have opened on the table. It's probably hard to see, but you notice the very first entry in this court docket comes on September 13th, 1681. We see it says Province of Pennsylvania at the court at Upland. That term Upland is a really important term that we'll dive into a little bit more. It's an old Swedish term. It reflects the very first European inhabitants in this area who were from Sweden. Upland is an area in Sweden just north of Stockholm. So it's really interesting because Chester County, it doesn't exist yet. In fact, the term Chester County does not appear in this court docket all the way until page 9. So for 9 pages, this court docket is existing, but we don't see the term Chester County mentioned once. So, and you see the first time it is mentioned, you see it says at the court held at Chester for the county of Chester. That's kind of why I named this presentation for the county of Chester, because this is the first admitted or official mention of the Chester County government in February 1683. And another thing, and I don't want to dive into this too much because it can get really confusing. I could probably do a whole presentation on this, but if you look closely, you see February 1682 written in the text, but I wrote February 1683. When I go play the presentation or the video later, there's about 2 other instances like this, and it's confusing because it's a different calendar. We are all familiar with Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar we use today, beginning on January 1st ending December 31st. That calendar has been in use in the English world since 1752. The entirety of American history has happened using the Gregorian calendar. So we really don't pay attention to this. But in 1752, the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian calendar, which started on March 24th and ended on March 25th and ended on March 24th. So it's a little confusing. So again, I'm looking at a time period where they were using the Julian calendar. And for us, a new year begins on January 1st. So if we see something that's in January, February, or March, we have to understand that we're shifting that to a new year. So if we look at that court record again, we see February 1682. When I'm converting it, I'm moving it up to the next year. So there is a little discrepancy. Never trust a historian who says, trust me, but trust me on this. This is what we're doing here. Stacy, if you don't mind maybe dropping a link to that write-up. Swarthmore College, they have a really nice write-up on the Julian calendar and converting it to the Gregorian calendar. But again, if you see January, February, or March, just recognize that there might be some conversion going on. But all you have to know is the very first mention of the Chester County government comes on in February 1683. So I always like to ask questions before I dive into a presentation. So what are my two questions? Well, I'm looking at the very first entry in this court docket, and I'm looking at page 9. So when I first observed this, my first question is, okay, why September 13th? Why does this court docket begin right here? It's not like the Chester County government was created then. So what government is this? Why does this start when it does? And that's the question I'm going to answer in this presentation that I'm presenting right now. The second question I'm going to ask or answer is what was happening between page 1 and page 9. That's obviously a transitional moment, right? We're transitioning from Upland to Chester. So that's a question. But then also, what did this place look like? What were the court cases that were happening? What was daily life like here? So I'm literally looking very thoroughly at every single entry, not every single one, but pretty closely between pages 1 and page 9. And that's the question I address in the video. So for this presentation, my goal is to get us to September 13th, 1681. Once we get to that point, we're going to zoom in and look at those first 9 pages of the court docket. So to begin, we have to zoom really far out. Get ready for a history lesson. If we zoom really far out, we're basically wondering, okay, how did Europeans, because Chester County government is a European government, how did Europeans first come to this area along the Delaware River? And to understand that, we have to take a look at what Europe was like in the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s. Historians refer to this period as an age of exploration, an age of discovery. It was a transitional moment. Europe was transitioning away from this system called the feudalist system, right? The idea that large land holdings and the peasantry and knighthood and lordships and the Catholic Church, that's what ruled Europe for 1,000 years. All of a sudden, after the Renaissance, Europe's transitioning away from that, and they're embracing this system called the mercantilist system. Mercantilism was this idea that national wealth didn't come just from large landholdings, but that national wealth came through trade and commerce and foreign exports. They wanted to limit the amount of dependency on other countries, so they wanted to have claim to as much raw material as possible. How do you do that? Well, you create colonies. If you could say this area belongs to Dutch or England, that means you don't have to depend on other countries anymore. So this triggered a rapid race to colonize parts of Africa, South America, North America. Obviously, there were some very real and serious unethical consequences from that, right? Slavery, colonialism, imperialism. But this was the nature of Europe in the about 1600s. I love this painting by Lorraine because I think it captures the spirit of mercantilism really well. It's called Seaport at Sunset, and we see the sun. So that implies the sun is setting in the west. That's where everyone's focus was, South America, North America. That was west of Europe. You see ships and boats because basically the name of the game at the time was have a large navy. If you have a large navy, you can compete on these foreign markets. But then you also, at the very forefront, you see these two guys kind of beating each other up because it was all about competition. Could the Dutch, English, French, Spanish, who could compete, who could control these foreign markets the best? And it also introduced trading companies, right? Trading companies were basically national companies or responsible for bringing wealth to the mother country. So you all probably are familiar with, or at least heard of the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was chartered, and their primary objective was to stimulate more trade with Asia. The Dutch wanted to have more markets and material from Asia. So in 1602, they said Dutch East India Company, increase trade with Asia. And a main objective they wanted to do was find a quicker trade route. It was a very far, difficult trip between Europe and Asia. It had to go like through the Arctic, I believe, I don't know. But they wanted a quicker trade route. So they hired a man named Henry Hudson in 1609. Keep in mind, that's only 2 years after the founding of Jamestown. So Europeans are starting to colonize the New World more. Henry Hudson, he's an Englishman. Jamestown is an English colony. So he believes the quicker passage to Asia is not going east, but by going west, kind of like Christopher Columbus. So in 1609, Henry Hudson leads an expedition to the New World, and he believes he can find a passage to Asia by using the navigable waterways of North America. So he lands around the Delaware Bay, and he enters the Delaware Bay, and he is credited with discovering the Delaware River for Europeans. He commented, and all of his men commented on the potential the Delaware Bay had for potential future settlement, but they weren't there to colonize at that point. They were there to find a passage to Asia. So he kept going north. He starts heading past what is modern day New York City, up to Albany, and he hits a roadblock, but they do find something. They don't find the passage to Asia. They find beaver furs and bear furs, deer hides. They find all these North American furs that are very highly coveted in Europe. So again, what's the name of the game? Mercantilism. So they said, okay, we didn't find the passage to Asia, but we think this will be a really good investment for the Dutch, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So we're going to start a country or a colony here, and they named it New Netherlands. That's basically what New York is today. Their capital was New Amsterdam, which is now on Manhattan Island. But keep in mind, it wasn't just the Dutch in North America. You also had the English. You had the Spanish in Florida. You had the French in Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, and Canada. By the 1630s, there was another country that wanted in on the game, and that was Sweden. We don't really think of Sweden as this aggressive, ambitious country, but don't be fooled. In the 1600s, there was probably not a country more ambitious than Sweden. Why is that? Because there was this terrible event happening in Europe at the time, known as the 30 Years' War. Most historians actually kind of say this is probably one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. It was basically a religious war between Catholics and Protestants. And the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, he was enjoying sweeping military successes on the battlefield for Sweden, so much so that when there were negotiations, all of a sudden Sweden had a seat at the negotiating table. Sweden was earning a lot of national prestige for their success in the 30 Years' War, but they didn't want to stop there. They wanted to continue this pattern. They wanted to continue building a reputation for itself. So what did they want to do? They wanted to enter the mercantilist economy. So they started forming colonies, and in about the early 1630s, they formed the New Sweden Company. They wanted to establish a colony in North America to start growing tobacco. Maybe they wanted to start exporting some furs as well. The only problem is they didn't have a clue where to begin because Sweden historically wasn't a great naval power. They didn't have colonies in North America. So they turned to a man named Peter Minuit, and it was literally a perfect partnership because Peter Minuit, for 5 years, he was actually the governor of New Netherlands. So he was very familiar with what North America looked like. He knew what territories were available. He knew how to operate in North America, but he was Dutch. So why was he working for the Swedish? Well, in about 1631, the Dutch called him back and fired him, basically accusing him of corruption. So he was pretty ticked off with his bosses. So how do you get back at your bosses? You work for their competitors. So he was happy to work for the Swedish. The Swedish were happy to have him leading this expedition. So in about 1638, Peter Minuit, he boards a ship called the Kelmar Nickel and another one called the Fogelgrip. You can actually see a replica of the Kelmar Nickel near Wilmington. I've never been there yet. I want to get there, but you can see a replica of the Kelmar Nickel near Wilmington along the Delaware waterfront. But they head over in March 1638. And where do they head? Well, again, Minuet knows this area. So he knows where there's an opening. You have the Dutch basically in New York and New Jersey. The English, they're in Virginia, Maryland. So there's a little opening along the Delaware River. And remember, Henry Hudson commented that this is a good area for future development. So Peter Minuet, he points to a place on the map. He says, this is where we are going to establish this colony for Sweden. So again, March 1638, the Swedes head over and they establish their colony called New Sweden. They first land near what is today Wilmington, Delaware, and they establish Fort Christina in honor of their teenage queen, Christina, who was the daughter of King Gustavus Adolphus, who died in the 30 Years' War. So he was doing really well, but then he died in battle. So they named it Fort Christina in honor of their queen. And throughout, again, you see the years it existed, 1638 to 1655, about 17 years, relatively short period of time. For 13, or during that 17-year period, 13 voyages brought about 600 settlers to this area. And what's really interesting is most of these people who came to the New World under the Swedish flag were actually from Finland. Keep in mind, at the time, Finland was not its own country. It was a territory in Sweden. If you know anything about Finland, it's one of the most heavily forested areas in the world. So Finnish farmers had to deal with all these trees somehow. So they developed these agricultural methods to burn the trees and then grow crops in the fertile ash, which was fine. They did this for thousands and thousands of years. But by the 1600s, the Swedish government was like, you need to stop burning our forests. These are valuable to us. They help us produce iron with like charcoal and smelting. So by the 1630s, the Swedish government started penalizing the Finns who wouldn't stop burning the forest. They could either join the military because there was a war going on, or you could take your family and go across the Atlantic Ocean and help us populate this area called New Sweden. So it's really interesting. Even though the ships and the forts would have been flying the flag of Sweden, a lot of these people were ethnic Finns. So I will continue saying Swedes, but just know I'm referring to the nationality of Sweden. Ethnicity, they're probably going to be Finnish. They tried growing tobacco in this area. Actually, the area of upland was mainly Johan Prince, the governor. He basically designated the area of upland, which is equivalent to the city of Chester today. He wanted to grow tobacco there. That didn't work out too well because tobacco doesn't grow well in a northern environment like this. So they opted instead to invest in the fur trade. And you'll notice on this map here, notice how most of New Sweden, it's hugging the Delaware River because there's not going to be any infrastructure. Roads really weren't developed until later on. So the highways would have been the waterways, the main one being the Delaware River. So the majority of the settlers would have been hugging the Delaware River, basically between Wilmington and Trenton, New Jersey. One of those communities was Upland, which eventually becomes the city of Chester. In my opinion, and I think other folks would probably agree, I think New Sweden was destined for failure. Because remember, if we go back to this map, they were smack dab in the middle of a whole bunch of powerful countries like the Dutch and the English and the French. Sweden, they had their successes, but they could not compete with the Dutch and the English. So I think they were destined for failure. So the area along the Delaware River, they started building forts, to defend against the Dutch. This ticked off some of the settlers because what happens when you have a super militaristic society just building forts, worrying about defending others, you have a pretty authoritarian figure, and that's Johan Prince here. Historians say he basically served as a dictator in this area. So the Swedes weren't too happy with him. He actually built a mansion not far from where Philadelphia International Airport is today. So that's basically where he was governing from. So he was implementing some pretty strict laws. He had to defend against the Dutch. And actually in 1653, a group of settlers actually wrote him a letter saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing. They basically sent him a list of grievances. He said, and he actually ended up killing their leader. So Johan Prince was a pretty tough dude. But I think it shows you that the settlers weren't happy with their leader. And by 1654, the Dutch built this Fort Casimir right below Fort Christina. So now the Dutch are right on the opening of the Delaware Bay, meaning the Dutch completely control who goes into the Delaware River. That's strangling New Sweden. They are not able to determine what gets to the settlers. So combine that with Combine the fact that there is basically a foreign threat with a pretty nasty leader, New Sweden was destined for failure. By 1655, the Dutch completely capture this area from the Swedes, and the area transitions into New Netherlands. And you would think the Swedish settlers would be a little upset about this, but again, they have a lot of grievances with their governor. They welcomed a new leadership. And also remember, a lot of these folks were Finns who were sent over here as punishment, so they're not super patriotic. They don't really care who's leading them as long as they're left be and can live their life. So you see their Swedish identity is preserved. So it's not like all of a sudden Dutch families were replacing them. No, the Swedes stayed there. They were just now paying taxes and fees to the Dutch government in New Netherlands, or New Amsterdam, when Manhattan Island is. So again, I told you justice under the Swedes, it was mainly coming from Johan Prince and the governors at their mansion. In New Netherlands, the justice was administered at these local forts. Around these local forts were communities. And you see here, and I know it's very hard to read, so I'll try to do my best to read it. In 1657, the Dutch government in New Amsterdam, they allow the Swedes to continue operating in communities like Uppland. I think that's a Dutch version of Upland. You see Passyunk, that's a neighborhood in South Philadelphia now. Finland, I believe, this one I had to look up. I think that's where Marcus Hook is nowadays. I might be wrong about that. And then Kingessing, that's basically southwest Philadelphia near Upper Darby. So you see all of these communities are starting to form, and they're going to have their own local version of justice being served. But you see, by the timeline, 1655 to 1664, the Dutch were only in this area for a very brief time because the English are coming in. Between the 1650s and the 1670s, the English and Dutch are two of the world's most superior advanced naval powers. So of course, they're going to run into some conflict, especially when it comes to foreign colonies. So by 1664, Peter Stuyvesant, he surrenders the fort at New Amsterdam, which is at Manhattan Island today. When he does that, he's also surrendering control of this region along the Delaware River. So this area starts being incorporated into the Duke of York's authority, basically the King of England's brother, James, the Duke of York. He wants to start introducing English law to this area. So you start seeing the division of administrative. They're not necessarily counties yet, but you see administrative division. So you have these early predecessors for Sussex, Kent, Newcastle counties, the three counties in Delaware. And you also see this area called Upland. That's where we come into play, basically administrative area along the Delaware River known as Upland, responsible for administering the King's law, so English law. In 1676, the Duke of York passed a law saying that all these areas have to start keeping their own court dockets. And these court dockets have to be kept in English. So in 1676, that's when we get our very first court record in this area. Again, everything before this is basically just reports coming from the governors or little letters coming from the various forts. But in 1676, this is when we first get a court docket along the Delaware River. This one is from 1676 to 1681. Maybe you see where I'm going with this, because the one we have in the room begins in 1681. So where is this court docket kept? Well, there is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, there is a record called the Record of the Upland Court, 1676 to 1681. What we see here, it has at a court held at Upland, Delaware River, by the authority of the Sovereign Lord Charles II of England. May his reign takes me a second. 14th of November, 1676. So this is the very first page of that previous court docket. But you see on the side here, it has this name. It says J. Logan of Stenton. James Logan was a pretty prominent administrator. He held a bunch of political offices about the 17 teens. So I believe he probably had paid for a transcribed copy of that original Upland court docket. So I don't think the one at Historical Society of Pennsylvania is the original Upland court docket. Where is the original? I'm not sure. Is it out there? We'll see. I think if you look at scholarship, no one is quoting from the original record. Everyone's quoting from a 1860 typescript transcription that I have on the table. over there. So the original court of Upland docket is probably lost somewhere, but that's basically the first documented English docket that existed on the Delaware River. And you see here, it's basically swearing in all these justices, and check out their names: Peter Cock, Peter Rambo, Israel Helm, Lacey Andrus, Ollie Swan, Otto Ernest. These are all Swedish names from the Swedish settlers who arrived there decades ago. And a lot of these names you're going to see in the video when I start talking about the Chester County docket, because again, the Swedes were maintaining a unique identity in this local area. So again, keep in mind, so far, 1676, 1681, we're still under the authority of the Duke of York's authorities from New York. But then this is when we get to a story that we're all probably a little bit more familiar with. William Penn, right? William Penn, 1670s, he's this quote unquote radical Quaker. Quakers didn't believe in church authorities. They believed in the internal peace. So they basically said, we don't need the Anglican Church or the Church of England to help us believe in God. Who is the authority of the Church of England? It's the king. So the king is having this group of Quakers saying, we don't need the king to practice religion. So these Quakers are giving the king a headache. William Penn's father, Admiral William Penn, was owed a huge amount of debt because of some wars he was helped to fund. Remember, the Dutch and English were competing in wars. Those are the wars that William Penn's father helped fund. So the Penn family had a substantial debt they were owed. So it was a perfect opportunity for the king. The king said, hey, my brother has this land over there in the New World. I owe you money. You want to start a new colony? It's a win-win for everyone. So in March 1681, the King of England gives William Penn his royal land charter. But William Penn, he had a lot of work to do. You can imagine the amount of work is needed to govern a colony. So he basically stayed in England to start drafting a frame of government. He needed people to invest in his money. So he needed to write his very wealthy friends from London. So he basically appoints his cousin, William Markham. He tells him, go over there and start administering my colony for me. And he gives them, this is a transcription of the William Penn papers. And you see he gave out a whole bunch of, basically a to-do list for his cousin. You have to do A, B, and C. Of really unique importance is he tells him that you are to go over to this area and tell the inhabitants that I am the proprietor of this new colony. And then secondly, you have to go over there and basically erect a government, get a sheriff, get justices, get a prison keeper. Maybe he doesn't say explicitly, but it's probably implied, start a court docket, right? Because that's going to be a form of keeping track of this new government. So William Markham, he heads over to the New World. And where do you think he goes right away, William Markham? You can imagine if William Markham just arrives on the Delaware River, these families are looking at him, and William Markham said, hey, I have an order from the king and my cousin William Penn, we are now in control of this area. That probably wouldn't have worked out too well. So William Markham, he goes to New York City. This is basically the government center of this area of the Delaware River. He goes to the governor of New York, who was Governor Andrew Brockles, and he asks for a letter. He asked Governor of New York for a letter to show the inhabitants along the Delaware River. And this is that letter. It's a transcription, again, that's at Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I think it's really cool because the governor of New York is writing to the inhabitants on the Delaware River. He's basically thanking them for all their services and all the good they've done to the empire. And I think it's really cool because it says basically now you have to submit and yield all due obedience to William Penn and William Markham, and we wish you all the happiness. And at that point, we are no under control of the governor of New York. We are now, if you look closely, basically we now have a name to the several justices of the peace, magistrates, and other officers inhabiting within the bounds and limits above mentioned, now called Pennsylvania. So that's probably one of the first times anyone in North America ever wrote the word Pennsylvania. It's coming from the governor of New York. So William Markham, he now has this letter. He heads down south to the Delaware River, where he shows it to the local officials there saying, hey, sorry to tell you, but now me and my cousin, we have this new order from the governor that we're in charge. The thing is, the local inhabitants had just had court. So when was the last time the community met together for the last court session? Well, it was June 1681. And if we go back to that court docket that's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, we can see the entry for that last court session in June 14th, 1681. And the last entry is saying the court is adjourned until the second Tuesday of September 1681. So in June 1681, the court does its thing. It's still operating under the Duke of York. They're saying, cool, took care of business. Everyone meet here again, second Tuesday of 1681. And that, of course, is going to be September 13th, 1681. So that court docket that we have in this room right now, that is basically the very first legal document of Penn's new government. That's the first time the inhabitants of this area along the Delaware River are meeting to hold court and basically work together as a community. Everything before that was under the Duke of York's laws, and now they're for the first time hearing news about this guy named William Penn and his new government. And before I jump into the video, because I do explain this a little bit in the video, just imagine the diversity of this area, right? Because not only do you have the Swedish families, you have the Finns, you have some Dutch settlers who came here during the days of New Netherlands, but you also have a lot of now English Quakers, because English Quakers were primarily inhabiting West New Jersey. There was a colony called West New Jersey. William Penn was heavily investing in West New Jersey because he thought that was going to be the Quaker haven, but there were some financial issues, so William Penn ignored West New Jersey and he started his own colony. So you can imagine the excitement that English Quakers living in West New Jersey was having when they heard this guy, William Penn, was starting his new colony. So they're all coming over to be a part of his new government. You also have a lot of indigenous Lenape people because the Swedes, they were here for decades. They were working with them in the fur trade. You have some Lenape coming to this court session. So you have Swedes, Finns, Dutch, English, Lenape. Pretty diverse community gathering here for the very first meeting of William Penn's new government. And it kind of goes into that whole thing of a holy experiment, right? That was Penn's dream, to kind of create this safe haven for all people to practice all of their religious beliefs. And that's the community he inherited. So that was a very broad, quick presentation. Again, I was using very broad terms like king and country and governors. Now we're going to zoom in and look at very specific people. Instead of just saying settlers, we're going to look at the specific names of the people who were here during the first days of this government called Pennsylvania. So, Stacy, do you mind jumping in and playing that video? After the fact. But I just want to, before I open the floor up for questions, I just want to revisit these two questions that we began with early on, right? Why does this earliest court record begin on September 13th, 1681? Well, that's the first time that the government under William Penn met. That was the first time that these people along the Delaware River were aware of Penn's new proprietorship over the area. So this is the first time they're coming together as a local community. It's also interesting to note that this is probably, I think I said it before, this is probably the earliest legal government record in entirety in Pennsylvania, outside of William Penn's personal correspondence. But the Pennsylvania General Assembly, so basically the state government, does not meet until December 1682, so more than a year after this. Or Philadelphia, Bucks County, they don't form or get established until November 1682. So this is basically the earliest court record in Pennsylvania, or under the name Pennsylvania government. And then to what happened between pages 1 and 9, well, a thriving, diverse community continued to exist. This community, again, William Penn didn't get this colony, snap his fingers, and then there was a community. He basically adopted a community that was here for decades beforehand. And then why is this record here in Westchester? For the first 100 years, this court docket existed along the Delaware River when the county seat was in the city of Chester. But by 16 or 17, I'm in the wrong century now, by 1786, Chester County expanded so far north and west and south that they wanted to relocate the county seat to a more central location. So that's when they moved, or 1786 is when they moved the county seat from Chester to Westchester. What happens when, like, you move homes, right? You take everything in your old home and you move it to the new location. So that's why all the Chester County government records that were created before 1786 are in Westchester, because the Chester County government moved. And then in 1789, of course, Delaware County splits off and forms their own county. And just to recap on like a so what, who cares? It's 340 years. That's an old document, right? But I think there's more value than just being impressed by the age of this thing. The thing that I really geek out over is the fact that all these people, we hear the term or the 340 years, we're like, holy cow, that's historic. These people didn't think they were living in a historic moment. They were just going about their daily life. They were going to court. They were dealing with troubles with their neighbors. These are things you and I can relate to too. So it's kind of like this nice little thing that reminds us that we're part of this community that's bigger than all of us. So can Peter Rambo, Peter Yoakum, none of them expected to be featured in a historical conversation 340 years later. They were just living their lives just like you and I are doing that today. So cool. Thank you, everyone. Again, I'll be interested to hear your feedback on how that video streaming went. Stacy, if you could kind of fill me in on what questions folks are asking.
Sure. So we had a good discussion through the chat, but there were several questions about the first original counties. So if you could speak to that. So in addition to Chester County, were there other counties that were founded at the very beginning?
So basically, before William Penn arrived, everything in this area is referred to as upland. Like, it's not really a county, it's just an administrative area called locally, it's upland. So that would have been present-day Chester County, Philadelphia, Bucks, everywhere in Pennsylvania would have been referred to as this area called upland. And then basically in November 1682, Penn has all this land and he wants to create more responsive local government. So he divides the area between Chester, Bucks, and Philadelphia. Because this was the seat of upland, Chester County kind of just adopted the records of upland, but Philadelphia and Bucks started keeping their own court records, which I believe you can find transcriptions of their early court dockets online as well. I think they both begin in the 1680s, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but.
Okay. And then there was quite a bit of back and forth about the Quakers and the calendar. If you could speak to that a little bit more.
What's there to say? But basically, yeah, the Quakers were even more unique because not only did they use the Julian calendar before 1752, but they also opted not to use the names of months named after pagan gods. So I think it was like January, February, and March. So if you're looking at a Quaker record from like 1730 and you see the first month of 1730, recognize March is the first month. So I don't want to get into the details of that because, again, it's confusing, but that link to Swarthmore College does a really nice job of laying it out. And again, assuming you're looking at all American history records from 1776 to the present, don't think about the conversion between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar.
We had a question from Jeff, who just came in asking, did the western border of Chester extend beyond the Susquehanna? Has this work been indexed?
So yes, it has been indexed. You can find basically if you're curious, if maybe you have an ancestor and you want to know if they were represented in this court docket, you can visit our website and take a look at the indexes. And basically, yeah, in the very earliest days, there really wasn't a definitive western border for Chester County. Basically, was just west of the Delaware River. I can't speak to a settlement out that far west, but it was basically a borderless region they referred to as Chester County at that point. Okay,
I think that is, everyone said the streaming went well. They were very happy with the video. So John is asking here if he can access the video. We will be sending a link to that, John.
Yep. So, well, if there's no more questions, thank you everyone seriously for tuning in and joining us today. You will all receive a link to a video recording of this presentation, as well as a separate link to the video that we played. So you'll be able to rewatch both of these. So Stacey, I'm going to assume there was no more questions in the chat.
No.
Does anyone here have a question?
Nope, I think we're all good.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much, everyone. really appreciate everyone tuning in and learning a little bit about some of the cool things we have at the Chester County Archives, and I encourage you all to visit us. So I asked, those 2 questions I asked, that was questions I asked. You all can ask your own questions, then work with us in the Archives Research Room to explore some other facets of Chester County history. So, cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Stacy.